Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Voice of Authority webinar brought to you today by Montagu Evans. My name is Toby Fox, and I'm the Managing Director of 3Fox, the marketing agency for councils. Our job is to keep our network of councils and developers and investors and their influencers and advisors connected. And during coronavirus, we're doing that through a series of webinars that provide councils with a platform to discuss their ambitions, the challenges, their influences and issues of urgency that they face. Next week, we're going to be asking if some of our precious heritage assets might be undervalued in the prioritisation of growth and recovery in a session titled, How Do We Value Heritage in the Rush to Recovery? That's next Thursday at 11 AM. And then on September the 9th, our SiteMatch 365 platform features a briefing on new master plans and development opportunities coming forward in Croydon, with opportunities to meet one-to-one with council officers. I hope you'll join us for one or both of those events, and you can register for them at www.3fox.co.uk. But this week, boy, do we have something to live up to. You may have caught our excellent session on Tuesday, the Women in Planning takeover of the Voice of Authority. If you didn't, you have to watch it. You'll find the video on www.thevoiceofauthority.co.uk. What a panel. There were terrific technical insight, there was passion, and there was really considered responses to the government's planning white paper. And excellent chairing by Charlotte Morfett of Waltham Forest Council. I'm feeling the heat. So how could we respond to such a high benchmark? Well, obviously we had to wheel out some big guns, some potentates of planning, so to speak. And to that end, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome back to the Voice of Authority, the one and only Mike Kiley, Chair of the Planning Officers Society. And also to introduce, on this stage at least, though there'll be no strangers to many of you, some more of the great talent that planning boasts. In Caroline Harper, who is Chief Planning Director at Be First, and we hope shortly to join us, David Joyce, who is Corporate Director of Housing, Regeneration and Planning at Haringey Council. And from that wellspring of talent and of generosity, our sponsor today, Montagu Evans, their Head of Planning, Craig Blatchford. Welcome, everyone. Right. The last thing you need is me pretending to have as much knowledge of planning in my head as any of our panelists this week have in a single fingernail. So all I'm going to do is the housekeeping. Viewers, I know you're going to want to ask questions and our panel want to answer them. So please supply those and vote for them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. And we'll start putting the most popular questions to the panel later in the session. We'll also run some polls during this session to add a bit of fuel to the discussion and to see if you out there in Zoom land agree with our panel's take on the white paper. Now, what is their take? Let's find out by turning first to the great Mike Kiley and to ask you, Mike, first, what's the evidence that planning actually needs reform?
Well, Boris Johnson has argued that the newt counting delays has slowed down house building, and he said that we would build better and build greener, but we'll also build faster. And he concluded in the white paper, what we have now simply does not work. But where, as you say, where is the evidence for that? So in the last decade, local planning authorities have granted consents for over 2.5 million houses, yet only 1.5 million have been built. And in fact, the house building industry have consistently built about 1.5 million homes each decade, 150,000 a year. Last year, which was a record year, we granted consent for 371,000 homes, and yet the developers delivered 241. So it's not the planning system that's not granting the consents, it's the housing delivery system that's not converting these consents into homes. We also grant around 90% of all planning applications, and often the time taken to deal with applications is spent negotiating them to get them right, which we're required to do by the NPPF. And according to the consultation, that's the one on changes to the current planning system, that talks about there being 91% of local planning authorities having plans in place, but the white paper focuses on 50% of local planning authorities having an up-to-date plan in place post NPPF 2012. And often the reasons why local planning authorities haven't got a plan in place is the difficulty around housing numbers, and I'll touch on that later. So as I say, we don't build homes, we grant the planning consent. So it's not our fault that housing delivery fails to deliver. And why is that? Well, I won't go into it, but it's more to do with the financial side of purchasing homes and the changes to the way mortgages are offered. And if you want to get the full story on that, I recommend Josh Ryan Collins' book. He's from UCL, Why Can't You Afford a Home? And you'll see where the problems are and what we have to do to put them right. And he compares it to other countries who haven't gone down the road that we've gone down, and they haven't had the same problems. The other issue for me is that you've got a 300,000 homes a year target. But where has this come from? Is it empirically based? It's not. It's a political target. And I think there may be more buy-in if we actually had a target that was based on evidence rather than a politically based target. And finally, the white paper seems to promise everything in a new system. It will be simpler, faster, more certain, less contentious, etc. But it will be. What they're proposing is a system that will be so directive and inflexible, it seems, with these zones and pattern books, etc. It's hardly likely to result in less JRs, as the white paper sort of suggests. And so I think it's the case isn't there for radical change. I'm not saying there should be no change, and I'm not convinced that the new system is likely to be free of problems. It will have its own unique problems.
Thanks, Mike. Fighting talk. What would you pick out of the paper in terms of the sort of maybe is there an upside? Are there things that you're impressed by?
Well, I think there are, and I mean, I wanted to sort of touch on three areas and look at the benefits and problems in those areas rather than picking on three individual things. I was going to look at the new sort of local plan regime that's being proposed to see whether that is a better system. To look at the standard methodology, which is, you know, a fundamental building block in a local plan. You know, how many homes do you have to provide in an area? And then also look at infrastructure delivery, because I think that's an increasingly important part of what we do. Lack of infrastructure or infrastructure constraints, we're told, is one of the main objections that residents have to new development, understandably. So it's important that that's properly tackled. So, you know, the new local plan, there's three zones: growth, renewal, protection. Growth seems to have an outline permission, although I'm not quite sure what they mean by that, because an outline permission has planning conditions. So I suspect it's more of a permission in principle, and then the detailed consent will be approved either through a design code or some other sort of device. Essentially, most of the consents will be given either in the local plan or in supplementary planning documents or local development orders. Then there's at the other end of the spectrum, there's the protection zones, which is greenbelt, area of outstanding natural beauty, conservation areas. And I'm assuming it will also include open countryside, because the white paper does talk about, you know, protecting our countryside. And so those areas, there will be a presumption against development. Presumably it will be different in the different areas. The presumption in the greenbelt is different from the presumption in countryside. And any development will be subject to planning permission pretty much like you have now. And then between the two, you have this sort of renewal area, which is a little bit nebulous, but it seems to be you know, most of the brownfield land. We're required to set out land uses and rules about the form of development, density, height, etc. That's quite a task to actually decide the land use of every particular area. You know, we had a zoning type system many decades ago and found it was too restrictive. Certainly the feedback I've had from people in New Zealand and Australia who have those systems is that it doesn't really work. It's very complicated and time consuming, very contested. But that's what we're required to do. And again, it's not entirely clear in the white paper, but again, a similar range of tools, design codes, pattern books, LDOs will permit development, and I guess will be encouraged to maximise those. The MPPF will sit there with generic DM policies, which the white paper is either suggesting they're going to be fairly rigidly applied, or perhaps a looser system that you will be allowed to have your own sort of local policies. And I think there's some merit in that. And in fact, POS has been pushing for those sort of generic DM policies that are repeated in local plans up and down the country to be put in one place. But the importance of that, the reason why it doesn't work now is they don't have Section 38(6) status. And therefore they would need to be described in a way that they had primacy in decision making. Otherwise, I think trying to rely on the MPPF is a less reliable document, if you like, because you have to have regard to it, whereas the local plan policies, you must take the decision in line with them unless there's good reason to otherwise. So it's important that they pick up those nuances. Design codes, they are a great tool. There's not an awful lot of experience about how to use them and what they are. But the idea of having a design code for pretty much every site in detail, that's a huge amount of work. And is that something we really want to do? It's fine if you're dealing with sort of a greenfield site, be it a housing site or an industrial site. But in a sort of dense, complex urban area like London, Barking and Dagenham or Haringey, design codes, are they really the right tool? I struggle with that. So the other area I think is the DM sort of process in all of this. It seems that what government is saying, that DM will be a much more technical process. Officer will be checking compliance with rules. Certainly in my experience of 40 odd years in DM, no planning application completely complies with all the policies. So it's about that sort of nuancing of balancing those policies in order to make a sensible decision. How does that work with rules? Do you balance the compliance or otherwise with rules? It's unclear how government expects that to happen. And the notion that it will be a simple checking process, I think, shows their misunderstanding of the system and how it works, particularly in urban areas. The role of planning committee seems to be stripped right back. They're not going to be involved in that process of checking against the rules because government says that's technical. They were there to deal with matters of principle, even when they arise in DM, which won't be very often because most of the principal issues are designed to be dealt with through the plan making process. If only life was so predictable, it's not. So it's sort of the one thing I've learned is that I'm never surprised by what comes along that was unexpected. So it will be interesting to see how that goes. The final thing on DM is this thing around fees. If you don't get your decision out within 13 weeks or some limited extension of time, you've got to pay it back. If you lose your appeal, you've got to pay it back. How does that sit with trying to push for beauty? Are we going to be supported in pushing for good quality design? And if those are quite fine judgments. And so if you do push for beauty and refuse planning permission and you lose that argument on appeal, you're going to lose your fee, you're going to lose funding. And those two things don't really sit together for me. So moving on to the standard methodology, certainly POS supports this in principle. An awful lot of time and money is wasted arguing on methodologies, but we need a decent, proper methodology. So thanks to Litchfields for crunching the numbers. They've produced what I would call the policy off version of the new standard methodology, and that's produced some nonsense. Far too low in the north and far too high in the south. And just to give a couple of examples, Cumbria and Lancaster have been delivering just over, well, nearly 6,500 homes, but they're now required to deliver just under 6,000, so about a 6.5% reduction. Yorkshire and Humber, similar percentage. They're delivering just over 19,000 homes, but their target is now just under 18,000 homes. Cambridge is the worst of the lot that I could find. They're delivering just over 1,000 homes, but they're now required to deliver 745, a 43.5% reduction. There's something wrong, clearly, with that methodology. And then if you go down to the southeast and look at the sort of greater sort of southeast region, excluding London, That goes up from 68,531 to 81,427, and that's against just over a £50,000 delivery. So that's a 61% increase, their target, over what they're delivering at the moment. And London is even more extreme than that. The increase is 161%. Impossible. No one, for all his possible faults, no one could argue that Sadiq Khan isn't trying to grant consents. You know, he often calls in applications and grants permission against borough sort of refusals. London cannot deliver 93,532 homes a year without a serious review of the Green Belt. It is just not possible. So the standard methodology will be policy on. So those numbers, government will add policy and adjust for constraints, etc. But what's the basis for that? What's the strategy? You know, what is the vision for taking those decisions? How will government do that? You know, that needs to be transparent. We need to understand it. There's nothing about that. You know, are we going to have national regional planning by MHCLG in order to modify those numbers? We don't know. And then finally, infrastructure delivery. The idea is that this new infrastructure levy, which will be nationally set, will do everything, including affordable housing. Now, COS has argued for something along these lines, because the trouble with the delivering affordable housing through Section 106 is it's the victim in any viability negotiation. SIL is set, fixed. Other mitigation is necessary. You know, the roundabout, if it's not provided, then there's harm and planning permission will be refused. Affordable housing is the victim. So trying to deal with that is important, and government, to be fair, in its new viability guidance has made great strides to deal with that. But the thing is, if you do have a nationally set infrastructure levy, it must be comprehensive. We can't have tons of exemptions, and we've seen the sort of small house builder exemption proposed to be increased to sort of 40 or 50 units. If this thing is set properly, and the market, and it's only a relatively small percentage of development costs, and the market understands it and it's certain, then things will adjust. You know, small builders won't pay so much for the sites because this has to be paid. And the notion that one size fits all types of developments, I think government needs to think very carefully about that. You know, the difference in values between industrial land and housing land will vary. And the other important thing for me is how fine-grained will this be spatially? You know, I was chief planner at Tower Hamlets for 5 years, one of the smallest boroughs in the country. And the difference in land values across that borough was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. So it's really important that this is done properly. And the data is there, you know, in Zoopla and things like that, to have a system that would do that. But it's important that that's done. And the idea is to optimise the amount of money that's pulled in to fund infrastructure. And you know, and it needs to be a fairly rigid tax like SIL. I think there is still on-site provision, and that needs to be allowed for. There's not much detail in the white paper about that, and yeah, the other roles that Section 106 pays. So it's important that something like Section 106 is still there, so that where there is a need to contract with a developer to mitigate other things that doesn't involve the payment of money, then it's important that that is still there. So those are my sort of mixed bag of positives and negatives over those three sort of large areas in the white paper.
Fantastic, Mike. Thank you very much indeed. And that sets the scene very nicely for us. Caroline, I'm told that David is unable to join us. He's got technical issues with Zoom, and I'm sure everyone in the audience would sympathise with that. But that does mean that the role of giving us a local view on some of these issues is going to fall entirely on your shoulders today. But broad shoulders to take that weight. So, Caroline, we've heard from Mike some evidence, some questions around the evidence for the need for planning reform in the first place, notwithstanding the fact that there are some aspects of the white paper that have been welcomed widely amongst planners. But I'd be interested in your take on Mike's views there, and also in his particular assessment in some of what's good and what's bad around design codes and flexibility and clarity, and the problems around the housing targets, the methodology for setting housing targets, and so on, and also just in your role at Be First in the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, the council's development company, your view on whether these proposals are going to help you deliver better and deliver more, and if so, or if not, in what ways its effects are going to be felt.
Okay, big topics.
Broad brief.
Thanks, Toby. Hi, everyone. So as I've been introduced, I'm Caroline Harper and I'm the Chief Plan Director for Be First. We're the urban regeneration vehicle for Barking and Dagenham. And I'm just going to give you a bit of context. So we're a developer, we're a planning consultancy. We undertake the statutory services like planning and building control on the council's behalf. And the way that I kind of think about my team is that we do the grunt work and LBBD retain decision-making powers. We are, and when I say we, I mean Be First and LBBD, we're incredibly ambitious. We're intending to deliver 50,000 new homes, 20,000 new jobs over the next 20 years. And to be honest, when Darren Rodwell, leader of the council, speaks, those figures increase. So, the pressure is there to always be delivering. And at Be First, we're delivering a good chunk of those targets ourselves. We've got an incredible pipeline of primarily affordable homes, and also other exciting developments, so things like the film studios at Dagenham East. And Be First was born out of an aspiration to build things that are really good at what they do, and to do so quickly and inclusively. There is a really strong political desire to accelerate development and regeneration, and to do that at the benefit of existing residents, recognising that the borough's got some really challenging kind of socioeconomic circumstances. And I'll give you some stats just to give you a flavour of that. But life expectancy for both males and females is the lowest in London. We have the worst child obesity and amongst the highest for adults. We have one of the highest unemployment rates, and we've got the lowest median household income. So there's a lot of pressure on local services, and there is huge demand for social housing, which the borough cannot currently meet. And it's from this kind of broader position that I'm coming from when I'm reviewing the planning white paper. But before I get into that, I think there's a couple of caveats. One is, I think we have to remember that the white paper is not a fully formed document, and that there's more to come. And we can perhaps be generous, therefore, and take it as a starting point. And then secondly, our current planning system definitely has its problems. And, I don't agree that they're necessarily the problems that the government is touting. But I do think that one of the key problems is how planning is approached and applied, both by planners themselves and the wider property and development industry. And I think it gets lost that planning is so much more than words on a page. So I'm, all for the notion of doing things better and delivering more. And I think there are some good principles in the white paper, principles that I think we're actually already implementing at Be First. And one of those is, positioning planning as having real clout and importance. The white paper opens by saying that planning is no less at the heart of our most important national challenges. There's promise of a comprehensive resource and skills strategy to support the implementation of the government's reforms. And there is even an acknowledgement, not necessarily responsibility, but an acknowledgement of significant budget cuts in local authority planning departments. Now, of course, the strategy is useless if there's not financial investment. I am sceptical as to how we'll realistically sort of reimagine and upskill the profession if the government, as is put in the white paper, expects developer contributions to basically support planning departments. I just can't see how that would work. But going back to the principle, a good thing. And another good principle is the overhauling of local plans. We are in the process of putting together our local plan. It goes out for Reg 19 consultation in the autumn. Very much of the view, I've been pushing that this is a concise technical document. So I am very much in favour of the notion in the white paper of local plans being more tightly written, more quickly produced, and that these work in conjunction rather than repeating policies and legislation that is specified elsewhere. And I also think there's merit in the fact that, you know, one of the blessings and a curse of planning in this country is that virtually everything is negotiable. So I think the aspiration to provide certainty through rules and therefore to make local plans stronger actually has some potential. And the third thing that, or the third principle that I think is commendable as a principle is the commitment to using 21st century technology. And, you know, we should, as a profession and as an industry sector, we should be much more on it there. But dig into the detail of the white paper, and I really struggle to sort of understand how the proposals would deliver more and deliver better. So I'm generally supportive of a greater emphasis on design quality, but I am unclear why this is the one critical matter that warrants fast track treatment within planning. You know, building beautiful, whatever that means, is useless if the resulting development doesn't meet people's needs now or in the future. And, you know, Mike's already touched on this, but if it's not supported by appropriate infrastructure, including transport connections, and there's very little info on that. And it's really important. If you look at other parts of the world, I just think we are so far behind on getting these things right. You know, Germany had a track and trace system for coronavirus up and running very quickly. And one of the reasons that they were able to do that is that their synthetic infrastructure is so much more advanced and comprehensive than ours. The Dutch, you know, yes, they have a healthy regard to design quality, but they also prioritise the economy and accessibility. And the central government's national policy strategy, which is called infrastructure and spatial planning, you know, their tagline is to make the Netherlands competitive, accessible, livable and safe. But the white paper, you know, the discussion of the economy is absent generally. And it's also just no way near radical enough in starting to address England's shortfalls on delivering or prioritising infrastructure. And the way it's drafted, the government also seems intent on avoiding any responsibility for the provision of this infrastructure, which is, you know, is deeply problematic. The other thing that I wanted to touch on is that the white paper sort of claims sustainability is at the heart of the government's proposals, but there is very little detail and information of quite what this means in practice. Many of the proposals just seem to be regurgitated approaches of old. We might get new versions, but so what? And I just think that the white paper has missed a real opportunity to further the climate change agenda and really tie planning into facilitating environmental and energy improvements, but also setting planning into that much wider context of significant strategic interventions. And we haven't got that. And then sort of moving on to affordable housing, I just find the proposed approach just seems to defy logic. It commits to delivering the same levels of delivery as currently, but it just doesn't seem possible when it also seeks to raise the threshold for when affordable housing is required. It seems to be optional as to whether local authorities require on-site affordable housing and in which tenures. The responsibility of developers to deliver affordable housing seems a little bit based on some sort of moral obligation, which it's just not going to work. I'm hugely sceptical of the First Homes proposal, which just seems to be some kind of zooped up Staff for Homes initiative. And in any event, the onus on home ownership above all other tenures is just wholly inadequate. It does nothing to deal with people's very diverse and wide-ranging circumstances. And I'm equally unclear why the government would seek to control the portion of on-site affordable homes that ambitious local authorities like LBVD could purchase, as is set out in one of the proposals for a first right of refusal. I do think there's potential in linking the new levy to land value uplift, like serious potential. But as drafted, I just don't see how this is going to work. You know, a national charge, a national threshold, I don't understand how that is going to do anything and exacerbate current inequalities. There doesn't seem to be anything about how do we, you know, link together different parts of the country to sort of challenge and break down some of those inequalities. And then there's the fundamental thing that, you know, accruing money is pretty useless if it's not actually linked to actual land and on-site delivery. So I just wanted to end with two fundamental problems that I think underpin the white paper. One is, I think there is a complete misunderstanding of what planning is. And that is that planning is a facilitator. It's a critical facilitator and it's got very real outcomes. But what the white paper sort of fails to address is that planning is part of a wider development process. And it does very little to tackle that kind of bit between securing planning and then getting those buildings and places actually built. There's also a real problem with time here. These reforms are being touted as part of our economic recovery post-coronavirus. Jenrick says in his foreword, quote, "Millions of jobs depend on the construction sector and in every economic recovery it has played a crucial role." But this legislation, it has to go through Parliament, and then local authorities will have 30 months to get their new style local plans sorted out. And I'm relying a little bit on Simon Ricketts here on the timescales he's put on his blog. But if we're looking to get, as is the implication, that these reforms are in place by the end of this Parliament, which is spring 2024, then that means that the necessary legislation needs to be passed and in force with any accompanying regulations and guidance by the autumn of 2021. And that's fast. The 2011 Localism Act, which similar complexity, apparently, that took about 11 months. But I think more importantly, if we're waiting 3.5 years, which is what that is to the end of this government, for the planning system to be fixed, so as to stop, in Johnson's words, artificially constraining the country's potential at a time when the government is, Rishi's words, grappling with something that is unprecedented in terms of our economic slump, then I'm sorry, but we are absolutely screwed.
Caroline, thank you very much indeed. And what a phrase to end on. Absolutely screwed, Craig. We've heard an awful lot in the last half an hour about the state of planning and its role, and the evidence for or against the need for any reforms. We've heard a number of positives in terms of the opportunity to re-examine planning, and the emphasis on looking at design quality, on providing a basis, a rules basis for planning, and also incorporating 21st century technology. And there are some other admirable goals. I mean, you know, the need to address sustainability within the development process is really important, but that is, we're told, one of a number of things that are really not being tackled in any comprehensive or realistic way in this white paper. Would you like to sort of pick the bones out of any of what we've heard so far? It's a really useful but dense set of information for us, and also maybe give us a view from some of your clients across the country about whether the responses to all this new thinking are varying in different areas, particularly outside London, as we've heard from Caroline in East London this morning.
Sure, Toby. Morning, everyone. I have a lot of alignment with what Mike and Caroline has been saying, actually, and a number of our clients on both the public and the private sector side share their views and their concerns. If I just put into context in the same way as Caroline did of what we do at Montagu Evans and who our clients is, and then give you the context of their responses, so you get a feel for the type of people we're talking about. So we act for local authorities, government agencies, public sector, private developers, private owners, strat land providers, so the whole spectrum across England and the UK, not that the latter necessarily relates here, and ranging from large scale estate renewal, town centres, through to large garden village type proposals. So it gives you a flavour that we're not focused, or the views that our clients are providing us aren't focused into one sector. And if I can try and highlight the headlines for them as simply as I can, there is a lot of support for a comprehensive and wholesale reform of the legislation, more so than a tinkering around the edges. The view is, if we're going to make changes, let's make them comprehensively, fundamentally, and ideally do it once and do it right once. However, there is a very strong dose of skepticism amongst all of the clients as whether or not it actually will be achievable as the white paper suggests. Will it all be achievable? And more importantly, what will the collateral damage be along the way? And to quote a very important person in my life, my gran, you can't have your cake and eat it and not get fat. There will be consequential impacts of these changes on our system in some shape or form. The biggest concern that our clients are expressing at the moment on both sides of the spectrum is resource. The bit that Caroline and Mike referenced. How do you resource up local authorities to deal with the fundamental changes to the system? And by resource, we don't just mean have they got enough money to have enough planning officers to provide the service that they will be required, but have they got the right skill set? You know, one of the suggestions is that every single local authority will have a new chief officer of design and placemaking. You know, that's over 300 new posts that will have to be filled. And the suggestion is at the moment, we don't necessarily have the skill sets. I'm not sure I agree with that within local authorities to fill those posts. So that's one of the big issues. The other issue, you're asking the council to take on board changes in the system that they've not necessarily had to deal with in this way before. And that takes a mindset change as well. So how you bring people along with you, and I don't just mean councillors, officers, but as Caroline was saying, this is an interface with the public as well. How do you bring the public along, your constituents, the people that engage with planning, about the changes in the planning system? Without them just saying, oh, it's another change, and how skeptical they may be about those changes. So there's a lot more than just the changes as we see them. The other issue is, how is it all going to be paid for? You know, if we're going to be moving to a more local plan-based system where an allocation as a growth zone is the equivalent of an outline planning permission, how do local authorities get a fee for what will be a significantly greater amount of work they'll have to do in promoting that growth zone through their local plan? You know, are we going to see, you know, at a future stage, a new fee system come on board where you actually pay a fee to the local plan process rather than the development control process? So, you know, if you get to the, say, the call for sites stage in the new local plan process, if you put forward a site, depending on how big it is, will you pay a fee to the local authority for that process? I don't know, but there is that concern that there is, excuse me, more fee issues coming down the line that we need to think about. The other bits that they're raising, the idea of the infrastructure levy, very much broadly welcomed, but picking up on Mike's point, there's a lot of support still for retaining Section 106s. And as Mike says, Section 106s do a lot more than just deliver affordable housing. If we're not going to have Section 106 to deliver employment training, to provide controls over the use of land into the long term, travel plan requirements, etc., what are we going to use? So, you know, that's important to understand. My big bugbear, and anybody who works with me knows I'm banging the table on this all the time, is a local planning authority is only one piece in the jigsaw of promoting development and local plans. A huge part of that process are the statutory consultees, the Highways Englands of this world, the Natural Englands, the environment agencies, and anybody who's had to interact with them will realise that they're heavily stretched resource-wise as well. I describe them as completely unaccountable. And are very difficult organisations to interact with. If we're going to deliver on these timescales and deliver on some of these objectives and aspirations, those statutory consultees have to be properly brought into the system and become accountable. There's a suggestion in the white paper that they might actually be able to raise their own fees as part of the changes. I don't think any of our clients necessarily would be concerned about a fee being paid for their advice and their consultation response, but only if it came with it a more transparent and a more streamlined system of response. So I think that's a really key bit. And then just the final bit, and Caroline's rather stolen my thunder on this already, always a problem with coming near the end, is we're talking about a white paper and fundamental changes to the planning system, which will have to bring with it changes to a whole raft of primary and secondary legislation and guidance. And the white paper also references changes to or improvements or greater use of permitted development rights. So all of that comes with it, etc. So all of that legislative change, as Caroline said, under, I was going to quote Simon as well, under his blog, has to come in a remarkably quick period of time, effectively this time next year. And then once you've got that, together with the new methodology for infrastructure levy, the new methodology for setting housing requirements, you've got to try and understand it. And, you know, how are you actually going to apply it in the real world? So it is eminently applauded by many, the fundamental change. And I think everybody would like to work together to try and deliver that change. But in the immediate time period, there's a great deal of concern as what we do in the intervening period, what is going to happen. You know, there are reference in the white paper to transitional arrangements in relation to the local plans. But what about other aspects? You know, if I was a strategic land buyer or a local authority bringing forward a big development, I don't know ultimately what the infrastructure levy position might be at the end. So I don't know how much to pay for that land, what the impact on a CPO price might be, etc. So the advice we are giving our clients is to crack on. You know, don't sit back and wait for these changes to come in. You've got to crack on, because if you're not careful, these could be counterintuitive to what, as Caroline said, we're trying to do, which is kickstart the economy. If there's all this uncertainty about change and we sit back and wait for it, we're not going to deliver on what Boris and everybody else wants to deliver now.
Craig, it sounds like you know, if the white paper, the reforms are going to accelerate development and growth, it's only through the law of unintended consequences in that sense. And I take Caroline's point that we need to be generous to the extent that this is a reform in process, and it's not expected to provide all the detail at this point. There's a process to go through, but it strikes me that, Craig, that your point that it's a big shake-up. This isn't about tinkering around the edges. This is about fundamental reforms. That you don't really go about something like that without a desired outcome. If the objective is just to shake everything up and see what comes out, trying to squeeze that into a condensed time period without any idea of what you want at the end of it, other than this idea of beauty, which seems really nebulous to me. But you know, what do I know? I'm a presenter of webinars. We've got a world of brilliant brains out there that are watching this, and maybe it's time to involve them in the conversation. And
can I just make one quick point?
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I think one of the things for me, I think Caroline talked about the sort of purpose of the planning system, but one of the purposes that I think is often forgotten is to create a stable investment platform. And this came home to me when the PD rights for office to residential first came in. At the time, I was chief planner at Croydon, and we had a sensible approach to the fact that there was too much offices in Croydon. And we were, you know, we were dealing with sort of conversions of redundant offices into residential through the planning system. That came in, and what that did, it impacted on what was a nascent office redevelopment market that was starting. And those people who were converting offices into residential were then concerned that next door to them, they might well have poor quality development, because what they saw were these office residential conversions with 13.5 square metre flats. So that proposal by government killed off a nascent office regeneration market, and not killed off, but certainly stalled for a very long time the office to residential conversion. We obviously put a Article 4 direction in place as quickly as we could, but you know, the damage was done. So you know, the development investors who are investing millions and sometimes billions of pounds into redevelopments want to know that something awful isn't going to happen next door to them that undermines their investment. And an awful lot of these changes where, we're fast tracking, it's not clear that you can actually control the quality of the development. It's not about its external aesthetic beauty or whatever it is, it's how it functions, how it's supported. If those things are uncertain and developers get a default permission because the local authority hasn't got its act together or whatever, then that actually can do quite a lot of damage to that investment, that property investment market in that particular area, and stop development coming forward.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. It seems that a lot of the difficulties and with the new thinking is around the idea of treating planning in isolation, without thinking of it as part of a wider process. And all our speakers today have touched on that. But these are problems for our Chief Officer of Design and Placemaking to solve. And as Charlotte Morfitt has pointed out in the chat, that we may not be looking at more than 300 with devolution. We may be looking at fewer than 300 of those officers. We'll see what comes out of that process. Yet another big shake-up. But one question to each of you panelists before we move into the Q&A proper. Linda Hasey of Hertfordshire has said in the chat that she's got an opportunity to talk to Mr. Jenrick this afternoon. So I'm going to ask each of you to give Linda one point you'd like to raise or one question you'd like asked of Mr. Jenrick this afternoon. And we're going to start with, we'll start with you, Mike.
Well, I think I'll go back to what I said earlier on about, actually have a proper analysis of what is the problem with housing delivery. Look at the data, look at the empirical evidence, and it's not the planning system not delivering planning permissions, because demonstrably it has done, and there is a need to address it across a wide range of fronts. Yes, we do need to get more delivering agencies into the system. We do need to help the small builders. We also need, if you look at the data when we were delivering 300,000 homes, half of that were built by councils, and councils have been building up their delivery of affordable housing, council housing. But really, you need, if you'd have put the effort you've put into tinkering with the planning system, into getting that sector up and running, you would have moved a long way down the road of resolving the housing problem. So look at this problem properly, and not just the sound bites that please your I dare say your house building friends.
Back to the data from Mike. Linda, there's question one for you, Caroline.
Well, I think building on from what Mike has said, I would like 2 or 3 sentences that is the outcome of these changes, that are not move away from the nauseating, world-beating rhetoric, and actually is specific. And I mean, pretty boringly, but I would like that vision to be measurable. So, when they say, oh, it's going to be sustainable, what does that mean? What are they looking for? Okay. And then actually, it's much easier to work backwards as to how we get there.
Yeah. So what are the measurable objectives of the planned reforms? Great stuff. And Craig?
I was just going to agree with what both of my fellow panelists have said. I was also going to reference the fact that, the white paper in some ways is a manifesto for Boris, the only white paper ever with the Prime Minister's forward in it. But the question I would ask of him, particularly in the economic climate we've got at the moment and the need for change rapidly, is where is the money going to come from? Where are the resources going to come from to support the local authorities to help deliver it? It's all well and good giving them the stick. It's not working at the moment, it's got to work, but you've got to give them the carrot and the resource to help them do it.
Fantastic. So what investment is going in to support these reforms? Linda, you've got 3 questions from our panel, and anyone else is very welcome to join the chat and put their own questions. But I hope you'll share those with us, Linda, afterwards, and we'll share those with the wider community through LinkedIn and our other social channels. Now, we've got a question out here from Namar Hagiladi. One of the proposals in the white paper is the digitisation of processes. Panel, can you give us your review on how digital processes have impacted planning so far? And I'm thinking particularly in the last sort of 6 months since social distancing and lockdown, and in what ways could they be taken forward and improved on? Caroline, would you like to pick up on that?
Sure. I mean, as I alluded to, so I'm support the digitisation and also the nod towards automation, partly because I mean, and this is probably where I don't, I'm a little bit different to where the government's heading, but my view is that it can be used to free up people to actually do the thinking part of it. And I think as a profession, we have a responsibility to make sure that it doesn't become that we are box ticking, which is one of my sort of issues that can happen with planning now. Is it, you know, it's box ticking rather than thinking through how it becomes a 3D environment that we live and work in. So we have to move away from that. But there's just a lot of potential. Make lives easier. So actually we're using our brains for the thinking element, actually involving people more with the kind of, you know, fly-throughs and 3D and all that kind of thing for community engagement. Loads of potential there. I've spent the last year or so putting in fit for purpose software for my team with Tascomi, and very much see that as the first step. And I want us to be getting to the point that we can, you know, we can validate and put an application through so we know which policies are problematic and which aren't, and all the rest of it. And I think that could be really powerful. Resourcing, finance, etc., all that side of it aside, but there just does seem much more that we could all be working together, and this all can tie in statutory consultees and all the rest of it. But it's a huge job, and it goes back to my wider point of I don't think our infrastructure is there as a country to necessarily help us.
Yeah, no, fair point. Mike, we spoke about digitisation in planning very early on in coronavirus on one of our first webinars. How's the picture sort of evolved since then?
I think it goes over a whole range of areas. I think, you know, the fact that we're working digitally has enabled us to continue to work through coronavirus. I think a lot of authorities had the abilities in place but weren't really fully using them, and they've been forced to use them. So many have gone paperless by default now, or virtually paperless. I think you're right in terms of, Caroline's right in terms of using, you know, virtual or augmented reality in order to test developments, particularly tool developments, has been around for years. I mean, you know, we had a Z map in Croydon, you know, 10, 15 years ago that we were using. You've now got, I've forgotten the name of it, the 3D one that covers across London. So
View City,
yeah.
View City, that's the one. So you can, you know, you can plonk the CAD drawing, the 3D CAD drawing, and you can drop it down or move it to, you know, to test its impact on various areas. But for me, the really big area is this big data and the ability to use that almost in real time as, I think, a real substitute for the industry of so-called evidence that gets produced. That you know, this sort of data can be produced you know, relatively easily, and our ability to do that will increase. And you know, you can sort of almost press the button and get that snapshot picture of your economy or whatever it is in your borough to inform your decision. But the important thing is that, again, as Caroline says, is that strategic thinking about, you know, so what are we going to do in our area? You know, the political input to that, the community input into that, the business input into that, the professional input into that, informed by this data in a much more efficient way, rather than the rather cumbersome way that we do it now. So I think there's huge potential there, and you know, it's good that government are on board with this, but you know, it still needs to, you still need to make those decisions. The data won't make the decisions for you.
Yeah, and there's big questions around what data to be monitoring. There's so much of it available as well. We've got a session coming up with GHD on big data and regeneration. So that's all useful material for a couple of weeks' time, Mike. Thank you. Craig, over to you on digitisation. You're at that sort of interface between private and public sector as well. Have you noticed the way that the two sectors are working together, becoming influenced by increased digitisation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the committees that have been done remotely and digitally, some of those leave a bit to be desired. I had one recently where they've had a vote by all shouting aye, which I didn't quite understand how that would work. But But for me, for setting aside the development processing aspects that both Mike and Caroline have spoken to, for me, the digitalization or technology where it has its greatest opportunity for me, and picking up on one of the questions that was raised earlier, which is, is the new system, is speed being put to the fore and local democracy down the bottom of the list. Digitalization technology really allows for a much better engagement with consultees, and in both in terms of when you do it, who actually will interact. How many of us have been to public consultations on applications or development plans when you can pretty much guess the socio-demographic of the people who attend, probably generalizing now, but the youngsters, the future, they very rarely turn up to these events, and they should be turning up more regularly. And I think digitization and everything that goes with that will help a wider engagement, which will help planning generally.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks, Craig. Absolutely. I just run a little snap poll, and there's enormous uncertainty out there as to whether these changes are going to make things more complicated or simplified and speeded up. I think it is 64% of people unsure as to the outcomes of that. And I think that probably reflects what we've been saying and what was said on Tuesday as well. A technical issue, Mike, and the other panel members, what are your views, Joe Sargent asks, on raising of small sites threshold for affordable and social housing provision and the increasing emphasis on first homes away from social affordable rents?
Yeah, I mean, two parts of that. I think it sort of demonstrates the government's commitment to the provision of affordable housing, I think, and other sort of infrastructure. There's no real evidence of the need for this. If the obligations still are known, clearly in advance, then developers can factor them into their costings. So all this will do probably is to increase the price paid for land in order to deliver, one or two houses or whatever it is in a particular development. So I think it's unfortunate that government are proposing this at a time when we've got a housing crisis and we do need to, maximise all the channels that we're trying to use to deliver more affordable housing. So it's hard to see how they can, what they're weighing up when they're making these decisions. In terms of their new sort of housing policy, it is just a refresh of their previous one. It's now a 30%, I think, reduction in price. It's supposed to be in perpetuity. The devil will be in the detail about how enforceable that will be, but given that this is probably just as much to allow people to buy a better home as it is to buy a home, and you compare that against people who cannot get a home and are either homeless or living in overcrowded situations in B&Bs, you do need to question whether where their priorities lie. So it is a policy which is unsurprising from a government that it is what it is. It is clearly prioritising home ownership over housing the population, and I think personally I think that's the wrong priority given the scale of the crisis.
Thanks, Mike.
There is a massive, as a father of 3 children who are all now in their 30s, there's a massive bunch of people who really struggle to buy a home who are not in poor quality jobs.
Yeah. No, thanks, Mike. And Caroline, you're nodding, and I'm assuming that you'd agree with Mike, but feel free to pick up on that point. And also a question from Ian Lawson around accessible and adaptable housing, the lack of detail around any requirements for that in the white paper. Will it be mandated in the NPPF or left to each local authority to decide?
Yeah, I mean, I echo what Mike said on the home ownership. It makes me really angry, actually, and I just find it incredibly insulting of the white paper to talk about home ownership as dignity, as if not to own a home is in any way undignified. And again, it just shows the government's lack of grasp on the realities of our country. But anyway, in terms of adaptable and accessible homes, I mean, it's a big topic again, partly because I don't think the approach currently is quite right. It's very tick in the box. How we get something that actually, or I think it's more thinking and applying it rather than having these kind of tick in the box approaches. And you know, the assumption I think generally is if you need an adaptable house, then you must be in a wheelchair, which is just not the case, and things like that. So it needs to be more nuanced than it is currently, I would say.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. And I'm afraid I'm going to give you the last word on that. Craig, we'll put that question to you after this session, and your responses to that by email, and to any of the other unanswered questions from our viewers, we'll put by email, and then we'll circulate those through social channels. But for now, we're hard to believe though it is, an hour has flashed by, and we have to let our audience get back to work and put some of what they've learned today into action. And what a lot of learning. Panel, you've been magnificent in helping us work through what's heading our way, and we couldn't have asked for better consideration from you. It's really helpful. On behalf of all our viewers, thank you very much indeed. Craig Blatchford, Head of Planning at Montagu Evans, Caroline Harper, Chief Planning Director at Be First, and Mike Kiley, Chair of the Planning Officers Society. And thanks most of all to you out there, our viewers. The only thing that we all agreed on and that we all had certainty around in the end was in our last poll, which asked, should the government introduce clear transitional arrangements? Everybody's in agreement that we don't have enough detail now. So thank you very much indeed for all your questions. We've left so many of them hanging. We will put them to our panel and respond through social media in the coming days. And we're going to be back in a week with our session, How Do We Value Heritage in the Rush to Recovery? And you can register for that and watch the video of this session and all our other webinars at www.thevoiceofauthority.co.uk. And you can register to watch Croydon's development briefing and for one-to-one meetings with the council at www.sitematch365.com. If you'd like to get involved in these sessions as a sponsor, as a speaker, please email me, Toby, T-O-B-Y, at 3fox.co.uk. Meanwhile, from our sponsor, Montagu Evans, from our panel, from me, and from everyone at 3Fox, goodbye.
Goodbye.